I woke up to my daughter-in-law Elizabeth saying, "Finally, we can sell this place and split the money," while I was still hooked to machines in the ICU. She thought I was unconscious, but I heard every word about my funeral arrangements, the real estate agent already contacted, and how relieved they'd be when I was finally gone. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning too, just not my funeral. The steady beep of the heart monitor had become my metronome for the past 3 weeks, marking time while my body slowly fought its way back from what the doctors called a massive cardiac event. That's medical speak for my heart deciding to take an unscheduled vacation while I was making Sunday dinner for the family. One moment I was pulling the roast from the oven, checking to make sure it was perfectly golden brown the way my late husband Bernard always liked it. The next, I was waking up to fluorescent lights and the sound of my own family dividing up my belongings like vultures at a roadside carcass. You have to understand, I'd spent 52 years in that house on Maple Street. Bernard and I bought it in 1973 when John was just 18 months old, back when the neighborhood was full of young families and the American dream still felt achievable on a teacher's salary and a plumber's wages. Every room held memories that felt as solid and permanent as the foundation itself. John's first steps in the living room, where I'd spent countless hours on my hands and knees encouraging him to walk to me, birthday parties in the backyard, where Bernard would set up elaborate treasure hunts that had the neighborhood children running through our garden beds, Christmas mornings in front of the fireplace, where we'd watch John tear through wrapping paper with the pure joy that only small children possess. The kitchen was where Bernard had taught John to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, flour dusting every surface as they competed to see who could flip them highest without losing them to the floor. The basement workshop was where father and son had built birdhouses and model airplanes, where Bernard had patiently taught John to use tools properly and safely, where the smell of sawdust and machine oil had become the scent of masculine bonding in our household. The master bedroom was where Bernard and I had whispered about our dreams late into the night, where we'd planned John's future and our retirement, where I'd held my husband's hand during his final days 5 years ago, when cancer took him far too early. After Bernard passed, that house became more than just my home. It became my anchor, my proof that I'd built something lasting and meaningful, something that would outlast the temporary sorrows and small daily struggles that make up most of human existence. Every creaking floorboard, every familiar shadow cast by afternoon sunlight, every corner where dust gathered in patterns I'd learned to recognize over decades of careful housekeeping, all of it formed the physical foundation of my identity as a woman who had successfully created a life worth living. But as I lay there in that sterile hospital bed, tubes snaking from my arms like mechanical ivy, and oxygen flowing through my nose with the consistency of artificial breath, I learned that my sanctuary had become my son's retirement plan. John and his wife Elizabeth had moved in temporarily 3 years ago when their own house went into foreclosure. What started as a few months of help while they got back on their feet had stretched into permanent residency, with Elizabeth gradually redecorating my kitchen in shades of beige and cream that made the room feel cold and unfamiliar, John taking over my late husband's workshop for his own projects that never seemed to get finished, and both of them treating me like an inconvenient tenant in my own home rather than the woman who had sacrificed for decades to create the stable foundation they were now enjoying. The conversation I overheard that Tuesday morning revealed the true scope of their planning, and the casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical assault. Elizabeth's voice was low but excited, carrying that particular tone people use when they're sharing gossip about someone else's misfortune or discussing an unexpected windfall that's about to change their circumstances dramatically. "The realtor says we could get at least $600,000, maybe more if we stage it right and wait for the spring market. Florence has been keeping it so outdated with all that heavy furniture and those old-fashioned colors, but buyers love the bones of these older houses, especially in this neighborhood. Florence." She was talking about me as if I were already dead, using my name with the detached familiarity of someone discussing a former acquaintance, rather than the woman who had welcomed her into this family, who had helped plan her wedding, who had quietly paid for the down payment on their first house when they were struggling young newlyweds with more dreams than financial sense. John's response made my stomach clench with something deeper than physical pain, something that felt like the fundamental reorganization of reality itself. "She's been unconscious for 3 weeks now. Dr. Peterson said brain activity is minimal, and even if she wakes up, there could be significant cognitive damage. We should start making arrangements." His voice held no grief, no sadness, no trace of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, or the young man who had cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Just the practical tone of someone discussing a business transaction that needed to be handled efficiently and without emotional complications. I wanted to sit up, to scream, to let them know I could hear every calculated word and that my brain was functioning perfectly well. Thank you very much. But my body was still betraying me in ways that felt both frustrating and terrifying. The machines kept their steady rhythm while my mind raced, processing the implications of what I was hearing with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. They weren't just planning my funeral, they were planning my complete erasure, the systematic elimination of my presence from the life I had spent more than 7 decades building. Elizabeth continued with the kind of detailed preparation that showed this wasn't a spontaneous conversation born from sudden grief, but rather the culmination of discussions that had probably been going on for weeks. I already talked to Miller's funeral home. They have a package deal that includes cremation for under $7,000. No point in a big service when she didn't really have many friends left anyway, and most of the people she knew from teaching are probably dead by now. The casual cruelty of that observation hit me like a slap across the face. Didn't have many friends left, as if friendships naturally evaporated with age, rather than being systematically discouraged by family members who found my social connections inconvenient and my independence threatening to their long-term plans. "What about the will?" John asked, and I could hear the anxiety creeping into his voice, like water seeping through a crack in a foundation. "That's the beautiful part," Elizabeth said, and I could picture her satisfied smile, the expression she wore when she'd successfully manipulated a situation to her advantage. She never updated it after Bernard died. "Everything goes to you automatically as the sole heir. The house, the life insurance policy, even that savings account she thinks we don't know about. She's been so careful with money all these years, living like a Depression-era grandmother and refusing to spend anything on herself, like she was hoarding it all for some special occasion that would never come. Well, I guess this is her special occasion. The savings account. They thought they knew about my careful accumulation of funds over the decades, the modest nest egg I'd built through years of clipping coupons and buying generic brands and making my own clothes instead of shopping at department stores. But they had no idea about the investment accounts Bernard and I had built through his union connections, the rental properties I'd quietly purchased over the past 8 years using the life insurance money from Bernard's death, or the trust fund I'd established to ensure my financial independence well into my 90s. Let them focus on the house and the obvious bank account. Those were the least significant parts of a financial portfolio they couldn't even begin to comprehend. As the days passed and my physical condition improved in ways that clearly frustrated the nursing staff who had been preparing for a very different outcome, I began to fully grasp the extent of their presumption and the depth of their betrayal. They'd already started going through my personal belongings with the systematic thoroughness of professional estate sale organizers. I caught Elizabeth photographing my jewelry collection for insurance purposes, she explained when I questioned her through the medication-induced fog that made my words come out slower than my thoughts, though her flushed cheeks and defensive tone suggested purposes that had nothing to do with protecting my assets for my own benefit. John had been in my home office, going through Bernard's old papers and my personal documents, ostensibly looking for important paperwork that might be needed for medical decisions, but clearly cataloging anything that might have financial value or legal significance. He'd made photocopies of bank statements, investment letters, and insurance policies, creating his own files that he kept in a briefcase I'd never seen before, one that suggested a level of planning that made my blood run cold, even through the pharmaceutical haze that was supposed to be keeping me calm and comfortable. The most painful discovery came during my second week in the hospital when I was finally strong enough to ask specific questions about what was happening at home. I'd inquired about my cat Doris, a beautiful calico who had been my constant companion since Bernard's death, and Elizabeth had looked genuinely surprised that I'd brought her up. "Oh, we took her to the shelter," she said, with the casual tone of someone mentioning they'd dropped off dry cleaning. "We couldn't take care of a pet on top of everything else, and it seemed cruel to keep her locked up in the house while we were spending so much time at the hospital." Doris. My sweet, gentle cat, who slept on Bernard's side of the bed and followed me around the house like a furry shadow, who had been my comfort during the loneliest nights after my husband's death, who represented the last living connection to the life Bernard and I had built together. Gone to a shelter where a 13-year-old cat would almost certainly be euthanized within days because older animals are considered unadoptable burdens. "Which shelter?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember," Elizabeth said with an indifferent shrug. "John handled it. Someplace out on Highway 9, I think. When I asked John about it later, he couldn't even look me in the eye. Mom, we had to make some hard decisions. The cat was old and we didn't know when you'd be coming home or if you'd be able to take care of her properly. We thought it was the most humane thing to do. Humane. They'd sent my beloved companion to die alone among strangers because taking care of her would have been inconvenient, and they called it humane. But the discovery that truly crystallized my resolve and transformed my grief into something harder and more purposeful came when I was finally strong enough to walk to my bedroom during one of their hospital visits. I found boxes in the closet, not just any boxes, but the carefully labeled containers that professional organizers use when they're systematically packing up someone's entire life. They were already sorting through my most personal possessions, dividing decades of memories into categories like items at a garage sale. One box was labeled Photos, Keep Good Ones, and contained albums that chronicled John's childhood, my marriage to Bernard, family vacations, holiday celebrations, and milestone moments that represented the best parts of our shared history. Another box was labeled Photos, Discard, and held pictures that apparently didn't meet their criteria for preservation. Images of me with friends from my teaching years, pictures of Bernard's family who had never been Elizabeth's favorites, snapshots of ordinary moments that hadn't been deemed worthy of keeping by people who'd never lived through them. A third box contained Bernard's military medals from his service in Vietnam, his union pins from 40 years of steady work, his reading glasses that I'd saved because they still held the impression of his nose, and his wedding ring that I'd planned to be buried wearing when my time actually came. All of it packed away like artifacts from someone else's life, ready to be disposed of or donated according to the convenience of people who had no appreciation for the weight of such things. But what truly broke my heart was finding my recipe box, the wooden container where I'd collected 4 decades of family favorites, church potluck contributions, and holiday traditions that I'd planned to pass down to John's future children. Elizabeth had gone through it systematically, pulling out recipes she deemed too old-fashioned or too complicated, leaving behind a sparse collection of simple dishes that could be prepared quickly and without much thought or skill. She'd thrown away my mother's handwritten recipe for Christmas cookies, the card for Bernard's favorite birthday cake that I'd made for him every year of our marriage, and the detailed instructions for the Thanksgiving stuffing that had been requested by relatives for 3 generations. They weren't just packing up my belongings, they were erasing the evidence of the life I'd lived, editing my existence down to whatever seemed useful or profitable to them. That night, I made a decision that would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking and long-term planning. I called my old friend Philip, who had been Bernard's law partner before Bernard went into plumbing and who had handled our wills, estate planning, and property transactions for more than 30 years. Philip understood family dynamics well enough to know when legal intervention was necessary, and more importantly, he knew exactly how much my family didn't know about my actual financial situation. "Florence, he said when he arrived at the hospital the next morning, dressed in the same careful way he'd maintained throughout his long career and carrying the leather briefcase that had been his trademark for as long as I'd known him. "You look remarkably well for someone who's supposed to be at death's door." I managed a weak smile that probably contained more steel than he expected from someone in a hospital gown. "Apparently, rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated, Philip. But I need your help with something, and it needs to be handled very carefully and very quietly." What I explained to Philip wasn't just about the house or the inheritance or even the cruel disposal of my cat. It was about respect, about the fundamental dignity that every person deserves in their own home and their own life, regardless of their age or their temporary vulnerability. Over the next several days, we quietly put together a plan that would protect my interests while teaching my family a lesson about assumptions, gratitude, and the dangerous consequences of treating other people as obstacles to your own ambitions. The first step was updating my will and ensuring that my actual assets were properly documented and protected in ways that would survive any legal challenges John and Elizabeth might mount. Philip helped me establish a revocable trust that would give me complete control over my properties and investments while I was alive, with very specific stipulations about inheritance that would depend entirely on how my family treated me going forward. The trust was structured so that John would inherit a modest sum regardless of his behavior, enough to ensure I couldn't be accused of complete vindictiveness, but the bulk of my estate would go to organizations and individuals who had demonstrated genuine care for my well-being. The second step was more delicate and required the kind of careful documentation that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Philip arranged for a private investigator to document John and Elizabeth's activities in my house while I was hospitalized, creating a photographic record of their unauthorized changes to my property, their disposal of my belongings, and their general treatment of my home as their own personal estate. The photographs that came back were even more damning than I'd expected. Elizabeth hosting dinner parties in my dining room for friends I'd never met, John's drinking buddies using my garage for their weekend poker games, and both of them clearly living as if they were already the legal owners of everything I'd spent a lifetime accumulating. But the most important element of my plan was the one thing they'd never suspect, the asset they couldn't even imagine because they'd never bothered to pay attention to my activities or interests beyond their immediate impact on their own convenience. Over the past 8 years, since Bernard's death had left me with more money than I'd ever expected to have, I'd been quietly purchasing rental properties around my neighborhood and in the surrounding areas. What appeared to be a network of friendly community connections was actually a carefully built portfolio of income-producing real estate, managed through a property management company that handled all the day-to-day operations while I maintained ownership and control. The apartment complex where several of my neighbors lived, the small duplex 2 blocks away that housed a young family with children, the converted Victorian downtown that provided affordable housing for teachers and social workers, all of it belonged to me, generating monthly income that had allowed me to maintain my independence while building wealth that no one in my family had even suspected existed. My tenants weren't just neighbors. They were people whose housing security depended on my continued good health and financial stability, people who had been watching John and Elizabeth's behavior with growing concern and increasing willingness to document what they observed. When I was finally discharged from the hospital 7 weeks after my heart attack, arriving home in Philip's car rather than the ambulance my family had probably been expecting, I came back to find my house transformed in ways that went far beyond simple redecorating. Elizabeth had completely reorganized the kitchen, throwing away appliances I'd used for decades and replacing them with newer models that she claimed were more efficient, but which looked expensive and complicated. She'd donated most of my dishes to charity, keeping only a basic set that would be adequate for 2 people, rather than the extended family gatherings I'd always enjoyed hosting. John had dismantled Bernard's workshop entirely, selling his tools and equipment to pay for what he called necessary home improvements that included a new television, updated sound system, and furniture that reflected Elizabeth's taste rather than mine. The basement space where my husband had spent countless peaceful hours creating useful and beautiful things had been converted into an entertainment room where John could watch sports and drink beer with his friends, surrounded by electronic equipment that cost more than Bernard's entire tool collection had been worth. "Mom," John said with forced enthusiasm when I walked through the front door that no longer felt like the entrance to my own home. "We've been getting everything ready for you." Elizabeth worked so hard to modernize the place and make it more comfortable. Elizabeth appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron I'd never seen before and carrying a casserole dish that smelled like something from a package, rather than the from-scratch cooking that had always been my pride. "Florence, you must be exhausted from all that time in the hospital. Why don't you rest in the guest room while we finish getting dinner ready? I've made your favorite, tuna casserole." The guest room. In my own house, after 7 weeks of fighting for my life, I was being relegated to the guest room like a visiting relative who couldn't be trusted with access to the main living areas. "That's very thoughtful of both of them. You," I said carefully, setting down the small bag of personal items I'd accumulated during my hospital stay. "But I think I'd prefer to rest in my own bedroom." Elizabeth's smile faltered slightly, revealing a flash of irritation she tried to cover with exaggerated concern. "Oh, well, we've been using that room while you were sick. Our old room is so small and cramped, and with John's back problems from all the work he's been doing around here, he really needs the firmer mattress and the better lighting. But the guest room is perfectly comfortable now, and it's closer to the main bathroom in case you need help during the night." John nodded eagerly, jumping in to support his wife's reasoning. "It's really more convenient for you, Mom, especially while you're still recovering. The guest room has a better access, and we've set it up with everything you might need." I looked around my transformed living room, taking in the new color scheme that made everything feel cold and impersonal, the furniture arrangement that prioritized Elizabeth's aesthetic preferences over the comfort and familiarity I'd cultivated over decades, and the complete absence of the family photographs and personal mementos that had made this space feel like home. "I can see you've made quite a few changes while I was away." "Just improvements that were long overdue," Elizabeth said, with that bright, dismissive tone that made my teeth ache. "The place was looking pretty dated, and some of your furniture was getting worn out anyway. We thought it would be nice for you to come home to something fresh and updated." My furniture. Pieces that Bernard and I had saved for and selected together during the early years of our marriage, chairs where I'd rocked John as a baby during long sleepless nights, the dining table where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday for 4 decades, the china cabinet that had belonged to my mother and grandmother before me. Worn out, apparently, though worn with love and history, seemed like a more accurate description. "Well," I said, setting down my hospital bag with deliberate care, I suppose we all need to have a serious conversation about living arrangements, now that I'm home and recovered. John and Elizabeth exchanged a look that I wasn't supposed to catch, but after weeks of practicing invisibility in the hospital bed while they discussed my future, I'd become quite skilled at reading those subtle communications that passed between them, like a private language of conspiracy and shared assumption. "Of course, Mom," John said, with the overly patient tone that people use when they're humoring someone they consider mentally diminished. "We want to make sure you're comfortable and properly taken care of. That's why we're here. And that's why we've been working so hard to get everything organized while you were sick. Taken care of." As if I were a burden to be managed rather than a mother to be respected, a woman with her own preferences and opinions, rather than a problem to be solved through their superior judgment and careful management. Over the following days, I began to understand the full scope of how my life had been reorganized during my absence, and the extent to which John and Elizabeth had assumed control over decisions that should have remained mine to make. John had taken over my checkbook and bank accounts, just to help with bills and expenses while you were unable to handle them yourself. Elizabeth had gone through my wardrobe systematically, donating most of my clothes to charity because your style was so outdated, and you'll want a fresh start now that you're getting a second chance at life. My car had been moved to the street because the garage was now John's workshop space, filled with projects that seemed to multiply daily without ever reaching completion. When I asked about the car's condition and whether it had been maintained during my hospitalization, John looked uncomfortable and admitted that they'd sold it to help pay for the necessary expenses that had accumulated during my illness. "You won't be driving for a while anyway," Elizabeth added helpfully. "At your age and after such a serious medical event, it's probably safer for everyone if you rely on other people for transportation. We can take you wherever you need to go, wherever they thought I needed to go," she meant, "wherever fit into their schedule and met with their approval. But the most revealing and infuriating discovery came when I tried to access my home office and found the door locked with a deadbolt that hadn't been there before my heart attack." "Oh, that," John said when I asked about the key, his voice taking on the defensive tone that had always signaled he was lying about something important. "We're using that room for storage while we sort through all of Dad's old papers and documents. You don't need to worry about any of that complicated financial stuff. I'm handling all the important paperwork now, and Philip says it's better to have everything centralized under one person's management. All the important paperwork. My marriage certificate, Bernard's military records, the deeds to my properties, my investment statements, my insurance policies, my medical records, my social security documents, everything that proved who I was and what I owned, locked away from me in my own house by people who had decided I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs." That evening, while John and Elizabeth were watching television and discussing their plans for updating the backyard landscaping, I called Philip from the kitchen phone, speaking quietly and keeping my conversation brief in case they were listening. "Philip," I said, "it's worse than we discussed. They've essentially taken over everything. I feel like a stranger in my own home." "Florence Bonavacalipidhoa," and I could hear the steel in his voice that had made him such a formidable attorney throughout his long career. "Are you ready to implement the comprehensive plan we discussed?" The comprehensive plan. It had seemed almost too dramatic when we'd outlined it during my hospital stay, but now, standing in my own kitchen and whispering like a conspirator about my own life, it felt not only necessary but long overdue. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Let's do it." The next morning, John left early for what he said was a job interview, but which I suspected was actually a meeting with a real estate agent, based on the property listing printouts I'd found in his jacket pocket and the measuring tape he'd forgotten to hide after what he'd called routine maintenance inspections of my house. Elizabeth was in the master bathroom, using my expensive face creams and perfumes, while complaining loudly about the outdated plumbing that would need to be upgraded before any potential sale. I made my first call to a locksmith who arrived within the hour, speaking quietly and efficiently as he changed the locks on my home office door and provided me with keys that would remain exclusively in my possession. By the time Elizabeth emerged from her lengthy beauty routine, I was sitting at my desk, going through the papers that my son had thought were too complicated for my supposedly diminished mental capacity. "What are you doing in here?" Elizabeth demanded from the doorway, her hair still damp and her face flushed with the kind of indignation that comes from having one's authority challenged unexpectedly. "I'm reviewing my financial documents in my own office," I said, without looking up from the investment statements that showed my portfolio had grown considerably over the past 8 years, thanks to careful management and the income from the properties that neither John nor Elizabeth knew existed. "John said he was taking care of all that complicated stuff," she said, stepping into the room uninvited and moving toward my desk, as if she had every right to examine my private papers. You shouldn't be stressing yourself with financial details so soon after your heart attack. I looked up at her then, this woman who had moved into my house, redecorated my rooms, disposed of my belongings, and planned my funeral while I lay unconscious. Elizabeth, I've been managing finances since before you were born. I think I can handle reviewing my own bank statements and investment reports. Her jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. Well, John is on all the accounts now anyway. You signed the paperwork before your heart attack, giving him power of attorney. I smiled then, the kind of smile that probably should have warned her about what was coming next. Actually, I never signed any such paperwork. But it's interesting that you think I did. What I discovered in my review of the documents was evidence of attempted forgery, clumsy attempts to reproduce my signature on various forms, including a power of attorney document that would have given John complete control over all my assets. The handwriting analysis that Philip had commissioned would easily hold up in court, but more importantly, it gave me the leverage I needed for what came next. John returned home that afternoon with the kind of satisfied expression that told me his morning activities had gone exactly as he'd planned. He found me in the living room, sitting in the one piece of furniture that Elizabeth hadn't managed to replace, Bernard's old recliner that I'd insisted on keeping despite her repeated suggestions that it was an eyesore that didn't match the new decor. How was your job interview? I asked pleasantly, though we both knew it hadn't been a job interview. He looked surprised and slightly guilty. Oh, it went well. Very well, actually. The position looks promising and the salary would be good. That's wonderful news, I said with genuine warmth. I'm sure it will be nice for you to have steady income again. Something in my tone made him pause, and I could see him trying to read my expression for signs of suspicion or anger. What do you mean by that? I held up the documents I'd been reviewing, not just my investment statements and property deeds, but the rental agreements for the apartment complex I owned, the lease contracts that showed several of my neighbors were actually my tenants, and most importantly, the eviction notices that Philip had prepared and filed that morning. I mean that you and Elizabeth will need steady income for your new apartment, I said calmly, because you'll be moving out of my house by the end of this month. John's face went through several interesting color changes, from pale surprise to flushed denial to a sickly greenish hue that suggested he was beginning to understand the full implications of what I was saying. Mom, what are you talking about? This is our home now. We've been living here for 3 years, taking care of everything while you were sick, making improvements and investments in the property. Taking care of everything, I repeated thoughtfully, letting the words hang in the air between us. Is that what you call redecorating my house without permission, throwing away my belongings, disposing of my cat, and planning my funeral while I was unconscious? The silence that followed was profound and telling. John opened his mouth several times without making a sound, like someone trying to formulate a defense for behavior that couldn't actually be defended. I heard you, I continued, my voice remaining conversational and calm despite the anger that was burning steadily in my chest. In the hospital. I heard Elizabeth talking about selling my house for $600,000. I heard you discussing cremation packages and funeral arrangements. I heard both of you treating my recovery as an inconvenience rather than a blessing to be grateful for. Elizabeth appeared from the kitchen, probably drawn by the tension in John's voice and the unusual length of our conversation. What's going on out here, Ye? She asked, though her defensive posture suggested she already suspected. Your mother-in-law is having some kind of episode, John said desperately, his voice rising with panic. She's talking about evicting us from our own home. Not talking about it, I corrected gently, standing up from Bernard's chair and feeling steadier and more confident than I had in months. Doing it. The eviction notices were filed this morning. You have 30 days to find alternative housing. Elizabeth's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications sank in. You can't evict us. This is John's family home. He has legal rights as your son, and we've put thousands of dollars into improvements and maintenance. I looked around the room that they had transformed according to their own preferences, taking in the expensive electronics they'd purchased with money from my accounts, the furniture they'd bought to replace my outdated pieces, and the general atmosphere of entitlement that had replaced the warmth and comfort I'd spent decades creating. Actually, I said with the quiet authority that comes from absolute certainty about your legal position, John has no ownership rights to this house. He never did. Bernard and I made sure of that when we set up our estate planning more than 20 years ago. This house belongs to me, and only me until the day I die. And contrary to your expectations and funeral planning, that day is not coming anytime soon. What I didn't tell them, what I was saving for the right moment when they'd exhausted their other options, was that I'd also purchased the apartment building where they'd been looking at rental units during their supposed house hunting expeditions. I owned their backup plan too, and their tenancy there would depend entirely on their behavior during this transition period. John was starting to panic now, his voice rising to a pitch I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in a particularly elaborate lie. "Mom, you can't do this to us. We gave up our own place to move in here and take care of you after Dad died. We've invested our time and our money into making improvements and keeping this place running. We've put our own lives on hold to make sure you were safe and comfortable." Safe and comfortable, I repeated, thinking about waking up in the ICU to hear them planning my funeral, about coming home to find my cat disposed of and my belongings sorted into keep and discard categories, about being relegated to the guest room in my own house. "Is that what you call it?" "We've been nothing but good to you," Elizabeth said, her sugar-sweet facade finally cracking to reveal the calculation and resentment underneath. "We moved in here to help you after Bernard died. We've taken care of this house and maintained the property. We've put up with your old-fashioned ways and your demands and your constant need for attention." "Put up with my demands," I said softly, letting the words settle between us like a challenge in my own house. "Well, it's not going to be your house much longer anyway," Elizabeth snapped, her true feelings finally emerging after years of careful pretense. "You're 73 years old and just had a massive heart attack. How much longer do you really think you're going to live? We're just being practical about the inevitable future." And there it was, the honest truth that had been lurking beneath every conversation, every false kindness, every concerned suggestion about my health and well-being over the past 3 years. They weren't taking care of me, they were waiting for me to die, positioning themselves to benefit from my death while doing the absolute minimum to ensure my comfort in the meantime. John grabbed Elizabeth's arm, recognizing that she'd gone too far and revealed too much, but the damage was done. The careful pretense of loving care had been stripped away, revealing the calculating opportunism that had been driving their behavior all along. "I think," I said, with the kind of calm that comes from absolute clarity about your situation and your options, "that's quite enough honesty for one day." I walked to my office and returned with a comprehensive folder that contained everything Philip and I had prepared over the past weeks. The eviction notices with official court stamps, the documentation of John's attempted forgery of my signature, the photographs of their unauthorized use and modification of my property, the evidence of their disposal of my belongings without permission, and most importantly, the new will that would ensure they never inherited anything significant from me, regardless of how long I lived. "John," I said, spreading the documents across the coffee table where they couldn't be ignored, "you have choices to make, and you need to make them quickly and carefully. You can accept the eviction notice and move out peacefully, in which case I'll provide you with positive references for rental applications and won't pursue criminal charges for the forged documents. Or you can fight this, in which case I'll be forced to involve the police and the district attorney's office, and your attempted fraud will become a matter of public record that will follow you for the rest of your life." John's face crumpled as the reality of his situation began to sink in, and for a moment I could see the little boy he had once been, the child who had always looked to me to fix his problems and make his mistakes disappear. "Mom, please." I never meant for things to go this far. Elizabeth gets ideas, and I just go along with them because it's easier than arguing. You know how I am. I've never been good at standing up to people or making difficult decisions. It was the same excuse he'd used as a child when he got into trouble by following the wrong crowd, the same justification he'd offered as a teenager when his poor choices led to consequences he didn't want to face, and the same abdication of responsibility he'd used as a young adult when his financial mismanagement had brought him back to my house in the first place. Always someone else's influence, someone else's bad idea, someone else's fault, never his own responsibility or his own moral failing. "John," I said with a sadness that went deeper than disappointment, "you're 52 years old. At some point in your life, you have to be accountable for your own decisions and your own actions, regardless of who influences or encourages you." Elizabeth wasn't ready to give up so easily, and the desperation in her voice revealed just how much she'd been counting on my death to solve her financial problems. "You're making a huge mistake, Florence," she said, her voice sharp with the kind of panic that comes from watching a carefully constructed plan fall apart. "Who's going to take care of you when you get sick again? Who's going to help you maintain this big old house when something breaks down? You'll be all alone here, and then what? You'll end up in some nursing home anyway, and we won't be around to make sure you're treated properly. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Cooperate with our takeover of your life, or face abandonment and institutional care when you need help the most. It was the kind of emotional manipulation that had probably worked on other elderly relatives, the fear-based coercion that convinces vulnerable people to surrender their independence in exchange for promises of care that rarely materialize as advertised. I smiled at her then, the kind of smile that held 7 decades of experience with manipulative people and hard-won wisdom about the difference between genuine care and calculated self-interest. Elizabeth, I've been taking care of myself and others for 73 years. I raised John as essentially a single mother while Bernard was deployed overseas for months at a time. I managed our household finances while working full-time as a high school mathematics teacher. I nursed Bernard through 18 months of cancer treatments, coordinating his medical care and maintaining his dignity until the day he died in our bedroom upstairs. I think I can manage to live in my own house without assistance from people who see me as an obstacle to their inheritance. What I didn't mention, what I was keeping in reserve for the right moment, was the support system I'd been quietly building over the past 5 years. Relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than financial calculation. Philip's daughter, Benjamin, was a registered nurse who lived in one of my rental units and had been checking on me regularly since Bernard's death, not because I needed medical supervision, but because we'd developed a friendship based on shared interests and compatible personalities. The young family in the duplex I owned, Doris and her husband with their 2 elementary school-aged children, had been bringing me homemade soup when I was feeling under the weather and including me in their holiday celebrations because they actually enjoyed my company. The retired handyman who lived in the apartment complex, also named Benjamin, a coincidence that had amused us both when we'd first met, had been maintaining my properties in exchange for reduced rent, but our arrangement had evolved into something more like a partnership. He'd been teaching me about property management and basic repair work, while I'd been helping him with the bookkeeping and financial planning that allowed him to expand his small business. When he learned about John and Elizabeth's behavior during my hospitalization, he'd volunteered to document their activities and had even installed security cameras that captured evidence of their unauthorized parties and their casual disposal of my belongings. I wasn't alone and I wasn't vulnerable. I was surrounded by people who actually cared about my well-being rather than my death schedule, people who saw me as a whole person with value and dignity rather than a problem to be managed or an asset to be liquidated. Over the next week, John and Elizabeth began the process of moving out, though not without considerable drama and several attempts to manipulate me into changing my mind. Elizabeth tried to take furniture she claimed they'd purchased, leading to several unpleasant confrontations that required Philip's intervention and the production of receipts that proved the items in question had been bought with money transferred from my own accounts without my knowledge or permission. John attempted to guilt me into reconsidering by bringing up memories of our better times together, promising that things would be different if I gave them another chance, and suggesting that my decision was based on temporary confusion caused by my medical trauma rather than rational assessment of their behavior. He seemed genuinely unable to understand that I had made a deliberate choice based on clear evidence rather than an emotional reaction that could be reversed through the right combination of apologies and promises. But the most revealing moment came when Elizabeth tried one final manipulation, arriving at my door with tears in her eyes and a story about being pregnant. A pregnancy that would give me a grandchild I'd apparently never get to know if I persisted in this cruel and heartless eviction. When I asked her to provide medical documentation of this pregnancy, she became angry and accused me of not trusting her, which was exactly correct. When I suggested we call her doctor together to discuss her prenatal care needs, she stormed out, and I never heard about the pregnancy again. The day they finally moved out completely, I stood in my living room and looked around at the space that would need to be restored to reflect my own taste and history. Elizabeth had taken most of the furniture she'd brought in, leaving the room sparse but somehow more spacious. The walls looked larger without her family, photos, ready to display my own memories again. The air itself seemed to circulate more freely without the tension of unwanted occupants and their barely concealed resentment. John came back that evening for one final conversation, looking exhausted and defeated in a way that reminded me of the little boy he'd been when he'd been caught in an elaborate lie and had to face the consequences of his choices. "Mom," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway because I hadn't invited him to sit down. "I want you to know that I'm sorry. I really am. Things got out of hand, and I let Elizabeth push me into decisions I shouldn't have made." I looked at my son, my only child, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep in this very room. the teenager I'd worried about through his rebellious years, the young man I'd been so proud of when he graduated college with a degree in engineering. John, I love you. I will always love you. But love doesn't mean I have to accept being treated as an inconvenience in my own life. He nodded, tears starting in his eyes as the full weight of what he'd lost began to sink in. Is there any way to fix this? To go back to how things were before? Things were never as good as you remember them, I said gently but firmly. You and Elizabeth have been taking advantage of my hospitality and my resources for 3 years. You've been treating me like a burden rather than your mother, like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The only difference now is that you got caught planning my funeral while I was still alive. We were scared, he said desperately, grasping for an explanation that might excuse the inexcusable. The doctor said you might not make it. We were just trying to be prepared for the worst-case scenario. Prepared for my death or prepared to profit from it? I asked, letting the question hang in the air between us. There's a difference, John. A very important difference. He couldn't answer that because we both knew the truth. The funeral arrangements hadn't been about grieving or honoring my memory. They'd been about minimizing expenses so more money would be available for other purposes. The house sale planning hadn't been about handling my estate responsibly. It had been about liquidating assets as quickly as possible to maximize their immediate benefit. After he left, I called Philip to let him know that the eviction had been completed successfully and that I was ready to move forward with the next phase of our plan. How do you feel, Florence? He asked. He asked, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. I walked through my house, noticing how different it felt now that it was truly mine again. The afternoon light came through the windows at angles I'd forgotten, and the room seemed to breathe more easily without the tension of unwanted occupants. The silence wasn't empty, it was peaceful, full of possibilities rather than dread. Free, I said finally. I feel free. Over the following months, I began to rebuild not just my living space, but my entire life, creating something richer and more satisfying than what I'd had before. Benjamin the nurse started stopping by regularly, not to check on my health, but because we'd discovered a shared love of crossword puzzles and British mystery novels. Our evening conversations over tea became a highlight of my week, the kind of easy companionship that develops between people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. The family in the duplex, Doris and her husband, began including me in their weekend activities, trips to the farmer's market, visits to local museums, family barbecues where their children treated me like an honorary grandmother. It was the kind of multi-generational relationship I'd always hoped to have with John's family, but without the underlying tension of financial obligation and emotional manipulation. Benjamin the handyman helped me restore the house to reflect my own preferences while upgrading systems that actually needed updating. Together, we converted John's former entertainment room back into Bernard's workshop, displaying his tools and projects in places of honor while creating space for new activities and interests. We established a reading corner in what had been Elizabeth's formal dining room, surrounding Bernard's favorite chair with bookshelves and good lighting for the literary pursuits that had become my primary pleasure. Philip introduced me to an investment club that met monthly at the library, a group of retirees who shared knowledge about managing portfolios and making financial decisions that would support long-term independence. I discovered that my careful accumulation of rental properties had positioned me well for retirement security, and that my instincts about real estate investment had been sound even when I'd been too modest to recognize my own financial acumen. 6 months after the eviction, I was sitting in my restored living room when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find John standing on my porch, looking older and more tired than I remembered, but somehow more genuine than he'd been in years. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. "Hello, John," I replied, but I didn't immediately invite him in. "I wanted to let you know that Elizabeth and I are getting divorced," he said, looking down at his hands rather than meeting my eyes. It turns out she had some debts she hadn't told me about. Credit cards, gambling, other things that I didn't know about until we started trying to rent an apartment and had to go through financial background checks. I felt a stab of concern despite everything that had happened. "Where are you living now?" "I'm renting a room from a coworker," he said. "It's not much, but it's what I can afford right now. I got a job at the engineering firm downtown. Steady work, decent pay, honest employment that doesn't depend on anyone else's misfortune." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of our complicated history settling between us like furniture that needed to be rearranged before we could move forward comfortably. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, finally looking up to meet my eyes. about being accountable for my own decisions. You were right. I let Elizabeth convince me to do things I knew were wrong because it was easier than standing up to her or facing our financial problems honestly. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I betrayed your trust, and I treated you terribly when you needed support and care. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, but all I saw was genuine remorse and a kind of exhaustion that suggested he'd been doing some serious self-examination. "What do you want, John?" I asked, not unkindly, but with the wariness that comes from hard experience. "I want to apologize," he said simply. "Really apologize. Not just say the words because I want something from you. I want you to know that I understand what I did wrong, and I'm trying to figure out how to be a better person, a better son." "That's a good start, Estil," I said, and I meant it. "Would it be possible?" He hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. "Would it be possible for us to have coffee sometime? Not here, not at my place. Somewhere neutral, somewhere public. I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship if you're willing, but I understand completely if you're not." I looked at this man who was my child, but had forgotten how to be my son, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not the sharp pain of betrayal, but something softer and more complex. Something that might eventually grow into forgiveness if it was nurtured carefully and honestly. "I'll think about it," as I said. "But John, if we do this, it has to be different. No more lies, no more schemes, no more treating me like I'm too old or too stupid to make my own decisions, no more waiting for me to die so you can inherit what I've built." "I understand," he said quickly. "No more of any of that." "I swear. And it has to be slow," I added. "Trust takes time to rebuild, especially when it's been broken as badly as you broke it." He nodded eagerly. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes, however long it takes." After he left, I sat in Bernard's chair and thought about second chances and family obligations and the difference between forgiveness and foolishness. I thought about the life I'd built for myself in the months since reclaiming my house, the friendships I'd formed, the routines I'd established, the peace I'd found in my own space, surrounded by people who actually valued my presence rather than planning for my absence. John had hurt me deeply, more deeply than I'd initially realized, but he was still my son. The question wasn't whether I could forgive him, but whether he could actually change enough to deserve the kind of relationship we'd both lost. Whether he could learn to see me as a person in my own right rather than as a source of financial security or emotional obligation. A week later, I called him and suggested we meet at the coffee shop downtown, the one that had been there since he was a child. It seemed like an appropriate place to try to start over, surrounded by memories of better times but firmly planted in the present, with no ghosts of old grievances or unmet expectations. Our first coffee meeting was awkward and careful, both of us navigating around the landmines of our recent history like people walking through a field where explosives might still be buried. But there was something different about John, a willingness to listen without immediately defending himself, a readiness to take responsibility without making excuses, a recognition that the damage to our relationship had been real and serious and couldn't be repaired with simple apologies or good intentions. "I never realized how much I sounded like Elizabeth," he said during our third meeting, stirring his coffee slowly while searching for the right words. "The way I talked about your age, your health, your ability to take care of yourself. It was condescending and cruel, and I'm ashamed of how easily I adopted that attitude." "It was condescending and cruel," I agreed, not sugarcoating the truth to spare his feelings. "But recognizing it is the first step toward changing it." Over the following months, we slowly built a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation, on genuine affection rather than guilt or expectation. John learned about my business ventures, my investment portfolio, and the network of friends and support I'd developed. He began to understand that I wasn't a fragile elderly woman waiting to be rescued, but a competent adult who had built a satisfying and independent life for herself. I learned about his struggles with depression after Bernard's death, his financial anxieties that had made Elizabeth's get-rich-quick schemes seem attractive, and his recognition that his marriage had been based more on convenience and mutual neediness than on love or shared values. He started therapy to address the patterns of avoidance and manipulation that had characterized his adult relationships, and he began to take genuine pride in the engineering work that provided him with honest income and a professional satisfaction. It wasn't the same relationship we'd had before. It was better. The little boy who had once depended on me had grown into a man who could appreciate me as a person in my own right, with my own wisdom, resources, and autonomy. The mother who had once felt obligated to solve all his problems had learned to offer support without enabling, love without conditions that bred resentment. The house that had been a battlefield became a genuine home again, filled with the kind of gatherings I'd always wanted. Chosen family as much as blood family, people who came together because they enjoyed each other's company rather than because they were bound by obligation or expectation. Benjamin and his family became regular fixtures, bringing laughter and chaos that reminded me why I'd loved being a part of a family in the first place. The young couple from the duplex contributed their energy and optimism to holiday celebrations that felt authentic rather than performed. John earned his way back into the circle slowly, proving through actions rather than words that he could be trusted with my affection again. He learned to ask rather than assume, to contribute rather than take, to see me as his mother rather than his eventual inheritance. He brought homemade bread to family dinners, helped Benjamin with home repair projects that benefited everyone, and participated in conversations without trying to dominate or manipulate the outcomes. On the first anniversary of my heart attack, I threw a party, not to celebrate my near-death experience, but to celebrate the life I'd built in its aftermath. My living room was filled with people who genuinely cared about my well-being, who saw me as more than the sum of my assets, who valued my presence rather than planning for my absence. John brought flowers and a card that simply said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." It was the first gift he'd given me in years that wasn't motivated by guilt or calculation, and it meant more than all the expensive presents Elizabeth had insisted on during their attempts to buy forgiveness for behavior that couldn't be excused. As I looked around the room at the faces of people who had become my chosen family, I realized that the heart attack that could have ended my life had instead given me a second chance to live it properly. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that happens to you, if you're brave enough to walk through it and wise enough to recognize the opportunity when it presents itself. My family had planned my funeral while I was in a coma, but I had planned something much more important. I had planned my life. And unlike their plans, which had been based on greed and impatience and the assumption that I was too weak to fight back, mine had worked out exactly as intended. I'd learned the difference between being loved and being useful, between being respected and being tolerated, between family that supports you and family that just waits for you to die. The house on Maple Street was mine again, truly mine, filled with people who chose to be there rather than people who felt trapped by circumstance or obligation. The bank accounts and investment portfolios were under my control, managed according to my values and priorities rather than someone else's timeline for my demise. The days ahead stretched before me like a road I could travel at my own pace, in my own direction, surrounded by companions I'd chosen for their character rather than their genetic relationship to me. John was part of that future, but as an adult son who had earned his place through changed behavior rather than a dependent child who expected support regardless of how he treated me. Elizabeth was gone completely, and good riddance. Some people come into your life to teach you what you don't want, and she'd been an excellent teacher in that regard. The cat Doris, my beloved calico companion, had been gone too long to recover, but Benjamin's family had introduced me to a senior cat named Philip, who needed a home after his elderly owner had passed away. Philip had settled into my routine as if he'd always belonged there, sleeping on Bernard's side of the bed and following me around the house with the devoted attention that only cats can provide. In the end, what I'd discovered during those weeks in the hospital, listening to my family plan my funeral while I fought to live, was that death isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. The worst thing is living a life where people see you as an obstacle rather than a gift, where your value is measured by what you can provide rather than who you are, where your absence is anticipated with relief rather than grief. I'd been given a second chance to build a life worth living, and I'd taken it. My family had planned my funeral, but I'd planned my resurrection, and my version had worked out so much better than theirs.